Welcome back, everyone, to the Risk Intel podcast, powered by SRA Watchtower, where we share risk intelligence with experts from across the banking industry. I'm your host, Ed Vincent, CEO at SRA Watchtower. Welcome back to the Risk Intel podcast. I'm thankful that Craig Hartman, the CEO and chair of PlanSmith, has returned to our show today and is going to spend a bit of time following on our last conversation about identifying execution risk or defining execution risk. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about mitigating execution risk once you acknowledge it exists. So, Craig, thanks for coming back and joining us today.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. This is I love talking about it.
I know this is your bread and butter, right? So you, as we talked about before, right? You've lived these concepts of planning and budgeting and how do you then deliver on that? And execution risk is a huge part of delivering against that plan, right? I love the closing comment you shared in our last conversation that execution risk is the umbrella over all types of risk. And I thought that's a really great way to think about it. And it encapsulates what is execution risk very, very well. Today, though, I'd like to take that a step further and say, all right, if we acknowledge that execution risk exists, what do you do about it? How do you reduce these types of risk? And so maybe we can start to unpack that a little bit around, right, what's the first step, right? How do you identify it? Maybe beginning there, and then what do you do once you've identified it to try and mitigate it?
Well, the key question is, what are the risks? And that's some of the tools that you have and we have is helping identify, bring them out, look at them, and figure out what the risk is and how it would affect you. What really is the impact? And that's key. I mean, that's the first step. I see it. Now, what'll I do about it? And
right.
Our responsibility, I feel, is not only just to identify it, but to help them understand what they can do, what their options are, or what basic things they can do to mitigate that. And to the extent that we also try to give them kind of a range of what that risk could be. In our business, interest rate risk is a big deal. So which way could rates go and how would that affect you? That's part of the whole risk analysis problem. But once I understand that, what are the plans I would have if things move this way or that way? I mean, that's typical. As I go back to my car analogy, I'm looking out, I see something happen. What are my options here? And
right.
we do that mentally very quickly, but sometimes in business, because it moves slower, it's harder to do.
It doesn't become apparent. So if you were to go about, right, identifying sources of execution risk, right, where do you look? Where do you start?
Well, first of all, the identification, then see, things are who's responsible for this particular opportunity or problem. Do we have the resources to do that? We've got a big technology change. Do we have any resources to meet that technology challenge? That kind of thing. Sometimes it's a little poorly defined what the goals or milestones are, because sometimes they lay them so far out
right.
the intermediate steps aren't apparent, and that's again part of the problem. Just external issues that we're out of control, and then the famous black swan, something happened, a bomb dropped on the bank. Oh my gosh,
right.
Never did that before. So those are obviously outside. The old adage about, you should control what you can, ignore what you can't, and just have the wisdom to know which one it is. And that's part of the problem, just and then
capturing all that, right? You just went through a litany of items there, right? Step one, capture that, right? Ask those questions, right? Are you right? Are you clear on roles and responsibilities? Are you resourced appropriately? Right? Do we have clarity? Do we have focus? Right? Are those goals right on what those goals are? Are people engaged? Are there external, dimensions, if you will, or events that need to be considered, right? And then getting that stuff down on paper, right? That certainly feels like that's a logical starting point.
Well, and then too, and I think one of the benefits that we're looking for AI is that corporate memory to remember what worked and what didn't work in the past, you know?
I like that.
Uh,
Yes.
and that's one of the things that AI does. It like when Big Blue played chess, it loaded up all the chess matches in the world, and then was
Right.
able to say, "Oh, this is number 5072. This is what we do." And that's the
Right.
same thing I think in a company. You want to remember what worked and what didn't, because I've been around when people bring up an idea, we say, "No, no, no, we tried that, didn't work," you know. Or sometimes you find something that worked, you just kind of keep doing it until it doesn't work. So those are some of the things that you want to be aware of, just getting that corporate memory and that uh, ability to bring that up and figure out it might not be the same thing, same kind of an idea, but executed differently. In this
I,
case,
I,
the web is a big factor. How did we do marketing before? How do we do marketing now?
yes. I love that corporate memory phrase. That really is right. We jump straight to AI, but AI is really only as valuable as all of those inputs, right? From that corporate memory, right? Those experiences, the events that how did you, right? What did you identify in the past? What actually occurred?
Well, because it has to be trained. And I'll give you an example. My partner here loves the New York Times puzzles, word puzzles. There's one that's got 7 letters with one in the middle, and you have to make as many words as you can using the letter in the middle. And she's very smart. She always gets 20, 22, 23. That's genius level, okay? I thought that's kind of interesting. So I took the puzzle, I took the instructions, and I put in the letters into ChatGPT, and I said, how many words can you get out of this? You know how many it got? 5. And I was talking to some friends of mine, and they said, well, it's never been trained to do that. Well, so it's not all powerful, you know, you've got to
Right,
train it. And so in the banking world or in corporate, you would have to get a lot of history of different
right.
situations and train it. So anyway, the corporate memory is kind of that without the benefit of AI.
I love that phrase. All right, so we've identified the sources of execution risk. Where do you go from there, right? What would a an approach be to then say how are we going to mitigate from here?
Oh, well, first of all, you know, just simply monitoring it more often as you keep your thumb on the pulse of what's going on. And more conversations and conversations within companies, within units. I know a lot of people say, too many committee meetings. Well, that communication up and down the line is valuable. What's happening? What do you see on the ground? What are we doing up in corporate? Where are they going? What do we see down here? Are they doing the right thing? You know, um, just and keeping logs is not a bad idea of what, excuse me. It doesn't sound like, you know, it sounds like a lot of trouble. Just somebody keeping track of what's going on and what does that mean? The other part of it is looking, you know, this constantly looking ahead at what things are going to affect you. You know, how do we view the future with, in this case, in terms of rates, or governmental oversight, or customer shifts in demographics? All those things you've got to be aware of, and that all feeds into what you know and what you don't know. I had a banker one time in Kentucky that was looking at a demographic mapping system that somebody was showing him, and he thought that was really neat. And they showed him a whole area outside of town that was being developed with new housing. He didn't know that, you know. So you've got to be
Wow.
aware of your environment, you know,
Right.
and see what's going on. And where do I fit in that context? So those are all keys. Again, identifying risks that aren't measurable internally, but are external risks. And even trends, and you can do that, trends internally that would, your whole company's getting old. You know, there's a resource problem. How do I find people who I can bring
Right.
in who are as savvy about my business and my customers as as these people are? And we had a
That's a
conversation one time with a teller, a lady who'd been at the bank for 200 years, knew everybody in town, and this new president came in, and he said, "I think I'm going to have to get rid of this lady. She's got too many people in her line, and she's very slow." And the chairman, I thought, was going to have apoplexy. He said, "You're kidding. You know why should the people line up there? Because they come to see her."
to see her, right?
Right. But it's that kind of, thinking
Right.
that you've got to decide. And that goes back to my point about just recognizing the value sometimes of age and so forth, and the risk you run of getting rid of them or losing them for right or death or retirement
Right.
or things like that. So
Right.
those are just more risks.
Look, in our last conversation, you talked about looking out the rearview mirror of what happened. You talked about looking at the dashboard as to what's going on now, and you talked about looking at the windshield as to where you're going and what could happen. And I think that came to mind as you talked about, picking your head up, looking at the outside environment, being aware of those external factors, right? All under that umbrella of monitoring, and having that feedback loop. So watch what's going on, feed that back. Make sure there's good communication between the folks that have crafted the plan, and then the folks that are executing it. So, monitoring, communication, feedback loops. I know project governance is also something that we've talked about as well in the past, and making sure you've got good controls. And that probably ties to the other theme one of the things we talked about previously of revisiting that plan as well. That's got to be part of
Well, the
governance.
flexibility in the plan is the key. It's not a straitjacket.
Right.
You've got to be recognized when you can change the plan to improve the outcome. And that goes back to my comment when people used to say, never change the budget, which came from never change the goals. And allegedly everybody was apoplexy if you were going to change the budget. So
The
flexibility.
reality is that there's that straitjacket comment is a great one that right. That's not going to survive. The world that we live in, right, is too mobile, too fluid, too agile. And if you can't iterate and you don't have flexibility in that plan, it's going to be worthless very, very quickly.
Right. You got to be able to put out the feelers for what's going on and how you're going to react to what you're going to do. And then that's the whole essence of it, is that paying attention more
Yes.
regularly, not just once a quarter or once a month, but maybe, this week and then 3 weeks from now, I get, something's developing that we want to see. So yeah, agility and flexibility, those are all key ways to control um, the direction you're going. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. The one final thought perhaps on this topic, which is ownership, and assignment of responsibility, right? We talked a little bit a second ago about governance, and revisiting of the plan and having that flexibility, being able to adjust. But we didn't really talk about clarification of roles and accountability, and being very clear on who is responsible for owning a given risk or a given area.
Well, I think that clearly responsibility and somebody who's leading the activity is important. However, sometimes, and this is a difficulty in corporations, sometimes things aren't working. And I think it's best if you can share that with other people in the organization to help you figure it out. But too often we're afraid to expose ourselves to the fact that something's not working. I'm not meeting my goal. I'm not quite sure why. So communication is key throughout the organization, because some other department may have some idea of what they could do differently, or where they could relieve the pressure or improve their outcome. That is another area that egos and people afraid of losing their job because they didn't meet goals or something has to be relieved. You have to give them a chance to say, I'm really having a problem here. I can't make it work without recrimination.
Yes, right. Being willing to share shortcomings or problems, right? There is, right. There's the communication aspect, but there's also, right, everyone's willing to communicate victories, right? But who's willing to communicate the failures or the shortcomings? And you mentioned this earlier about having the tone from the top, and really expressing a willingness and coverage, if you will, or safety for folks to say, yes, this is not working. This is a shortcoming, or this is, this is an area of risk that we have breached the threshold, right? And being willing and comfortable and tolerant of that being exposed and communicated. And so, you know, good governance and having strong project governance is only as good as the organization's culture and willingness to shine a light on those shortcomings.
A sharing culture, and we're all in this together, and so we want to help the weakest link work. And
Right.
that's, as you said, a corporate culture. It comes from the top, that the boss isn't going to beat up somebody because they didn't do something,
Right.
and sit and talk to them about what can we do to help.
Right. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. That seems like that's fundamental to mitigating execution risks, right? So we talked about a number of different techniques here to mitigate execution risk. Began by identifying the source of execution risk, um, monitoring it, putting feedback loops in place, communicating about it, looking at the outside environment, having agility and flexibility, and then this idea of the corporate culture of being willing to share the shortcomings, and then problem solve together at that point in time. Craig, I think we'll wrap here, but in our final part of this series, I'd love to come back and talk a bit about this playbook concept, because I think this has been something that you've thought about for a long time. You've delivered that as part of the solutions within the Plantsmith portfolio. And I'd love folks to learn a little bit more about what the playbook has meant to you and how you use it as a business, and how they could be thinking about that within their financial institution as well. So hopefully you'll come back and join us for that conversation next time.
Be happy to.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Appreciate it.